The Architecture of Erasure: How a Kingdom Vanished. For centuries, historians, theologians, and explorers have chased the same ghost. Where did the lost tribes of Israel go? The question itself suggests a mysterious sudden disappearance into the fog of history, perhaps to a hidden valley or a distant continent. But the reality is far more chilling. The fate of northern Israel was not a magical vanishing act. It was a deliberate, methodical, and historically documented process of erasure. Israel did not fall in a single afternoon. There was no final, glorious stand at a past like Thermopylae. Nor was there a singular moment where 10 tribes boarded ships and sailed into the unknown. Instead, an entire kingdom was dismantled, brick by brick, law by law, and memory by memory, until its identity simply evaporated. To understand how a nation of millions can cease to exist, we must look beyond the battlefield and into the structural decisions that made them vulnerable long before the first Assyrian arrow was fired. The rupture, to kingdoms, to destinies. The story begins not with conquest, but with division. After the death of King Solomon, the unified monarchy of Israel fractured. This split, recorded in 1 Kings 12, was driven by more than just pride or a tax dispute. It was a structural tearing apart of the nation based on geography, economics, and strategy. The territory split into 2 distinct systems. To the north lay the Kingdom of Israel. This was the prized land, vast, fertile, and crisscrossed by the ancient world's superhighways, the trade routes connecting the empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia. The north was cosmopolitan, wealthy, and economically integrated with its neighbors. It was a kingdom of commerce and open borders, absorbing ideas, cultures, and wealth from the surrounding nations. But this openness was a double-edged sword. It meant prosperity, but it also meant exposure. To the south lay the kingdom of Judah. By comparison, it was a backwater, smaller, rugged, and mountainous. Judah was isolated from the great international trade routes. This economic limitation, however, produced a paradoxical strength: isolation. Jerusalem remained the unshakable center of religious, administrative, and cultural life. The temple stood there, serving as a continuous anchor for the national soul. In Judah, identity was tied to a specific place and a specific covenant that transcended politics. The kings of the north faced an immediate existential crisis. They had the land and the money, but they didn't have the soul. Jerusalem, the only legitimate place of worship, was now in enemy territory. If their subjects continued to travel south for the feasts of Passover or Tabernacles, their loyalty would eventually drift back to the house of David. The solution devised by King Jeroboam was not an act of religious madness, but of political calculation. He understood that a kingdom cannot survive if its spiritual heart beats in a rival's chest, so he built a new system. He established Samaria as a powerful capital, a city designed for control and defense, perched high on a hill to dominate the landscape. 1 Kings 16:24. But a capital creates laws, not loyalty. For loyalty, he needed religion. Jeroboam established 2 strategic religious centers: Bethel in the south, right on the border to intercept pilgrims headed to Jerusalem, and Dan in the far north to consolidate the frontier. 1 Kings 12:26-30. At these sites, he erected golden calves. These were likely not intended as a rejection of Yahweh, but as a political adaptation, a localized, convenient version of the state religion. "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem," he told the people. He offered them convenience over covenant. From an administrative perspective, it was brilliant. Logistically, it was efficient, but spiritually, it was a lobotomy. By severing the connection to Jerusalem, the temple, and the Levitical priesthood, the northern kingdom fragmented its own identity. Faith ceased to be a transcendent reality and became a department of the state. 2. The illusion of stability for nearly 2 centuries. The system worked. The northern kingdom thrived. Its cities were organized, its trade flourished, and Samaria stood as an impregnable fortress. Archaeologists have found ivories and receipts attesting to the wealth of this period. Externally, there were no signs of impending doom. For the average farmer or merchant in the north, life was stable. There were festivals at Bethel, harvests were good, and the borders were secure. It is in this precise scenario, when the system is working perfectly, that warnings become impossible to hear. The illusion of stability is the most dangerous anesthetic. When the economy is booming, the suggestion that the nation is rotting from the inside sounds like madness or treason. This is where the prophets entered. Men like Amos and Hosea did not speak to a nation in ruins. They spoke to a nation at its peak. Amos thundered against social injustice and the false sense of security that wealth provided. Hosea exposed the spiritual adultery of a people who had traded their God for geopolitical alliances. They warned that the prosperity was a facade. The identity of the North had become tied entirely to its political structure, its king, its capital, its economy. There was no plan B. There was no preserved memory outside the land. The prophets saw what the kings could not. A kingdom that defines itself by its success has no way to survive its failure. Judah had a covenant that could survive in a dungeon. Israel had a system that could only survive in a palace. The people ignored the warnings. They reinterpreted their success as divine approval. As long as the trade routes remained open and Samaria's walls remained standing, they felt safe. But systems only function until the day they don't. And when the collapse came, it didn't come from a neighbor or a rival. It came from a monster. 3. The Assyrian Method, deconstruction of a people. The Assyrian Empire was unlike any power the world had seen. They were not merely conquerors. They were social engineers of destruction. Their goal was not just to rule over a people, but to dissolve them. They understood that a unified people will eventually rebel, but a scattered, mixed, and confused population will submit. The end of the northern kingdom did not happen overnight. It was a slow strangulation. First came the tribute payments, heavy taxes that drained the wealth of the land. Then came the puppetry, with kings installed and removed at Nineveh's pleasure. Finally, when Israel rebelled one last time, the Assyrian war machine arrived. The siege of Samaria lasted 3 years. It was a brutal, grinding blockade, but the biblical text to Kings 17 does not dwell on the military tactics or the heroism of the defenders. It focuses on the aftermath. When Samaria finally fell in 722 BC, the Assyrians did not just burn the city. They executed a policy of deportation and replacement. The Assyrian method was precise. They removed the leaders, the priests, the artisans, and the wealthy, the keepers of culture and memory. They marched them hundreds of miles away to Halah, to the Habor, to the river of Gozan, and into the cities of the Medes. These were not empty lands. They were established Assyrian territories with their own gods and languages. Simultaneously, the Assyrians brought in new people, Babylonians, Cuthites, Avites, and settled them in the cities of Samaria. These new inhabitants brought their own idols and customs, which immediately began to blend with the remnants of the Israelite peasantry left behind. This was the death blow. It wasn't the sword that killed northern Israel. It was the mixture. The people were separated, scattered, and placed in environments where their specific cultural and religious practices could not sustain themselves collectively. Without a central temple, without the Levitical law which they had abandoned centuries earlier, and without a unified leadership, the exiles had no anchor. A family taken to Assyria might hold on to their identity for a generation. They might tell their children stories of Jacob and the Exodus, but their grandchildren, born in Nineveh, speaking Aramaic, marrying locals, and worshipping at the local shrines, would only have fragments of memories. By the third or fourth generation, they were no longer Israelites. They were Assyrians with a peculiar ancestry. Northern Israel did not disappear because God forgot them. They disappeared because they had dismantled the very structures, the temple, the Torah, the covenant that were designed to preserve them. When the state fell, the people dissolved. 4. The contrast. Why Judah returned. Fast forward 136 years. The southern kingdom of Judah faces a similar fate. The Babylonians, the successors to the Assyrian power, batter down the walls of Jerusalem. The Temple of Solomon is burned to the ground, the house of David is deposed. The elite are marched off in chains to Babylon. On the surface, it looks like history repeating itself. Another invasion, another fall, another exile, but the outcome is radically different. Northern Israel vanished, Judah returned. Why? The difference lay in what they packed for the journey. When the north fell, they had already abandoned the central tenets of their faith for a state-sponsored religion. When the state died, the religion died with it. But Judah, for all its flaws and idolatry, had retained the core. Josiah's reforms, just a generation before the exile, had recentered the nation on the book of the law. Prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel didn't just warn of doom. They gave instructions for the exile itself. Jeremiah sent a letter to the captives in Babylon: "Build houses and dwell in them, seek the peace of the city. For I know the thoughts I have toward you." Jeremiah 29. He gave them a theological framework to exist outside the land. He taught them that Yahweh was not a tribal deity bound to the hills of Jerusalem, but the God of the whole earth, who could be worshipped even by the rivers of Babylon. In Babylon, the Jews did not dissolve, they clustered together. They preserved their genealogies without a temple. They invented the synagogue, a portable sanctuary of prayer and study. They focused intensely on the text. The scribe became as important as the priest. In the crucible of Babylon, the Jewish identity was hardened, not melted. 70 years later, when the Persian Empire overthrew Babylon, a miracle occurred. Cyrus the Great issued a decree allowing the Jews to return, and they were ready. Families like those of Ezra and Nehemiah could trace their lineage back before the destruction. They still spoke Hebrew. They still knew the law. They had a memory to return to. The lesson of the lost, the story of the lost tribes, is not a mystery to be solved with maps or DNA tests. It is a historical warning. The lost tribes are not hiding in a cave. They are gone. They were assimilated. They became the nations among whom they lived. They ceased to exist because they built a kingdom on political convenience rather than spiritual substance. They constructed a system that worked for the present, but had no capacity for the future. They tied their identity to structures that could be destroyed by human hands: a capital city, an economy, a border. Judah survived because their identity was anchored in something that could not be burned or conquered: the Word. They carried the text, and the text carried them. The ultimate tragedy of northern Israel is that they did not fall in a day. They fell over centuries of small, pragmatic decisions that moved them further and further away from their true center. By the time the Assyrians arrived, the work was largely done. The enemy only knocked down the walls. The people had already dismantled their souls. History is clear. Structures crumble, systems fail, capitals burn. Only an identity rooted in something eternal can survive the collapse. Judah returned because they remembered who they were. Israel vanished because they had already forgotten.